What's up, guys? This is Jimmy with Hifly Fitness. I'm here with another interview with CJ Allen, who is an elite powerlifter, and we're going to be discussing some different topics today, primarily about the differences between Eastern and Western powerlifting, weightlifting philosophies, and their periodization and their really base principles about how to perform the basic three movements. So first, let's talk about it. What are the differences between some of the major Eastern hemisphere periodization techniques versus the Western hemisphere, such as Jim Wendler's programs?
Okay.
Chico.
The Eastern methods are pretty heavily based on what we would call Soviet science today. A lot of the coaches from that era were really being pressured very hard to come up with methods that were superior to the other methods being used at the time, and to really take advantage of the system of sport that they had in the Soviet Union, which allowed them to really recruit the best talent and spend a lot of time in athlete development versus what was going on over here at the time, which was that our athletes at the Olympic level were primarily amateurs, and they were kind of training in their spare time instead of what they were doing over there in Eastern Europe, which is guys were living their entire lives for their sports. So they started to grasp that concept very early on before it really became popular, that you really got to get your athletes specializing if you want to maximize performance. And to me, that's the biggest difference between the two, is that Western methods tend to be very general and very basic, where they're looking at overall strength and they're looking at balance and they're looking at I would think of it more as like a fitness idea. They want to have everybody have a good general physical fitness, and then they want to build on top of that with linear progression or with block training to try to get an athlete ready for a peaking situation. Versus the Eastern methods tend to be a little more focused on the specific movements that the athlete's going to do in competition. So there's going to be a lot of volume on the specific contest lifts, sometimes to the detriment of work that we would consider balancing work or general work. So for powerlifting, a great example is Smolov or Shaiko, where both of those programs have you doing loads and loads and loads of volume on the main lifts, and then if you do accessory work at all, it's just very, very small amounts, and it's very targeted to a specific thing.
Okay.
That compares kind of to what we do over here with Western methods, where you would have 80% of the workout be accessory work. You do your main lift, and then you do 2 or 3 lifts that address different parts of that lift, and then you do some rehab work, and then you do some mobility work, and then you do some bodybuilding or something along those lines. Which, clearly that method works as well, but it's just not as targeted. And so you get athletes that might be a little bit more well-rounded in a physical fitness sense, but it doesn't always translate to the platform when they need it to. And that's an area where the Eastern methods really excel, which is, we might have athletes that aren't so strong on the accessory movements, or they're not so strong with the overhead pressing movements, but you put them on the platform and they're making gains on that, and their total is going up and they're doing better. And so they don't really care about that lack of generalization because it's a specific program. And when you're looking at advanced athletes, you are or should be beyond the idea of having to keep it general. If somebody's in an elite level of performance, then if they stop focusing on targeted work, then somebody else is already beating them because they are doing that. So those are the main differences, where it's just targeted work versus general work. The amount of volume that's put in and the amount of frequency that's put in tends to vary a lot. Western work, Western methods tend to be, upper body, lower body, twice a week. In the case of Wendler, like you mentioned, where a popular template for him has you squatting and deadlifting once a week each, benching once a week, overhead pressing once a week. So you really kind of just have a basic upper-lower split. The West Side Barbell method, which does borrow pretty heavily from Eastern methods, but it's pretty similar in that too, where it's essentially just an upper-lower split. And you've got a lot of other programs that are pretty similar. You've got the various linear programs that do kind of the same thing, versus some of the Eastern methods where they're full body, or it's every lift every day, or it's you're going to squat 4 or 5 times a week, something like that.
So a lot of people they're kind of turned off by the Eastern methodology because they think that the frequency is going to lead sometimes towards overtraining, or they're going to get injured, or something that's going to prevent them from making gains. Whereas they're more attracted to the Americanized, I guess, methodology because it seems to be more long-term friendly. Can you talk about why there may be a discrepancy there?
First, I got to say I'm not a huge fan of the idea of overtraining. I'm not denying that it happens. Clearly, sometimes it does. But in my experience, when people are really overtrained, they're not sore and tired and fatigued. They're in the hospital with compartment syndrome, getting IV fluids. So real overtraining to me is a pretty significant issue, and it's something pretty major. And when it does happen, it's the athlete is just absolutely run into the ground.
Yeah.
But the bulk of the time when you hear the term overtraining, it would be better described as overreaching, where maybe the athlete is just pushing a little hard for what their capacity is at the moment, or they're trying to advance a little bit too quickly and ending up kind of hitting a wall there. They're not always really overtraining, even if they think they are. So sometimes, they just they start to overreach and they don't give themselves time to adapt to it. And they always just back off and go back to another style of training before they've really given themselves a chance to get conditioned for it. And I think a lot of the reason that those lower frequency methods are popular is because they are easier, and they do require or they don't require as much attention to recovery, because if you're only doing a lift twice a week, you're going to have ample time to recover between it. And people look at the higher frequency methods. We mentioned Smolov earlier and Shaiko, where you're going to be doing full body every time you train. It's going to be 3 to 5 times a week. There's going to be a lot of volume on the main lifts. The intensity is going to be high. And people look at that and they think that they can't handle it, and then they don't even try. So they miss all of it because it's just daunting on the outset. And the reality is, for a lot of these athletes, is if you get them on a program like that and you put them under the bar and you give them time to get better, they might have some trouble with it at first, but eventually they will adapt. An analogy that I like a lot is one that John Brose uses, and he kind of compares it to a garbage man getting a new job. If he's never done that job before, the first day that he spends out there slinging garbage cans, he's going to be pretty fucked up. And he's going to be hurting. But if he does it every day for 2 or 3 weeks, eventually his body is going to adapt. But if he were to just give up on day one and say, that's it, can't do it, then he's just missed out on it because it's been difficult. So I think it's good to keep that in mind when we're talking about the frequency issue. But beyond that, I think it's important to look at context again and look at really what we're trying to do with the training. And if we're just looking for a general fitness approach or a bodybuilding type approach where there's not as much of a skill element, then maybe we don't need the frequency. But specifically for strength, you need the frequency because you need more time to practice that skill. And to me, it just makes sense to practice the skill that you want to be good at. And I compare it a lot of times to football. Can you imagine a football player going to practice twice a week and expecting to improve? No, it's stupid. He's going to be in practice every day, and he's going to be working hard every day, and he's not going to die. Yeah. He's going to be able to handle that and recover from it, and I'm sure he might have a hard week, but ultimately that time that he spends practicing is going to put him ahead of the guys that half-ass it and don't end up training as much or as hard.
Yeah. So another point that people like to make is if they start training kind of more high frequency, they need to go and enhance themselves with some sort of performance enhancing drug, because a lot of people don't understand really how the recovery process works. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that you need to have performance enhancers to be able to complete a program successfully, like an advanced Chico or Smolov program?
I don't say that you would need to have performance enhancement necessarily. There's guys that use those methods regularly that are drug free, and there's legit drug free folks. A lot of IPF lifters, a lot of USAPL lifters that really are genuinely clean, and they use those methods and they do well. There's a lot of high school coaches that I know using those types of methods with their athletes, and if there's doping going on at high school level too, but it's not nearly as rampant. So yeah, you can do well on those programs without it. The body is an incredibly adaptive mechanism, and it will make those adaptations with or without enhancement.
Yeah.
But the reality of sport is that the elite echelons are doping, and that's true in every sport, everywhere in the world. So there's going to be a point where an athlete will get to they'll get to a fork in the road where they have to choose whether or not they want to continue to be part of that elite group, or whether they're okay with maybe sacrificing some of that, or going less hard, or making a little bit less progress, or maybe backing off to a lower level of competition. So I don't think that you need the performance enhancement because you have to have it to train.
Yeah.
But I think that there's going to come a point where people have to have it if they're going to continue to make progress and to be competitive on the level that they want to be competitive on.
Okay, so obviously we talk about specificity and then context. So where does that lie with the novice athlete and the intermediate athlete and the advanced athlete as you keep going towards on the continuum? Mm-hmm. What would you recommend for a novice if they were to choose one of these, and would it really make that much of a difference if a novice started on 531 or if they started on something more specific with higher frequency? I don't know, more like the novice Chico adaptation of a routine.
Well, everybody's familiar with the analogy about everything works, but nothing works forever. And everybody's also familiar with the idea that a novice pretty much is going to make gains no matter what. Just going to the gym and doing some stuff is going to get them some gains. So that effect does work in their favor, and it makes it a lot easier for a novice to just put work in and see results just based on that. But I think that if they have access to the coaching and the equipment and to the kind of support that they need to train with that high frequency stuff, I want to get them on that right away.
Yeah.
If they know that they're a power lifter or a weightlifter or a strongman competitor or whatever, and they have their mindset, they've got a goal set, they know what they want to be training for, then I don't see a reason why we shouldn't just jump right in to the methods that we're ultimately going to use.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty personal thing for me as a coach because I find those methods to be superior in general, and I put pretty much all of my athletes on that style of training, and I believe in it. So I think that method is appropriate for everybody, but another coach who prefers to use block periodization, for instance, is probably going to disagree with me and say that he feels like it's better if they start more general. So there's going to be some context in just how the coach views that. But I don't think there's any basic physiology that limits us on doing that. I think there's plenty of examples of athletes starting with Chico or starting with the higher frequency weightlifting type programs where they're squatting 6 days a week, so on and so forth, and they make incredible gains just like novices in any other style. So it really just comes down to if they have appropriate programming and they've got appropriate coaching and they've got a good support network, then we can get them onto that type of programming right away and just keep going with it. But if they don't have the programming dialed in, they don't have the diet dialed in, they're not super proficient, then it might be better to start them off on a more general plan. So it just kind of depends on how much access they have to support, I would say.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people recommend these general programs simply because it makes it so they don't need so much attention to detail because they're so general. I mean, if you have a program like 531, you do 4 workouts a week and you do one movement primarily for each workout. So the coaching aspect of it is reduced. So some person on some Facebook group can recommend a program like that because it's so basic, I guess, and they don't need that coaching. And they can't really be wrong because they're not going to get injured likely on a program like that, and there's not going to be too much attention to detail that's required. So that might be a reason why a lot of people are running 5-3-1 type programs because, like you said, there's not one program that's good. It's more good. What's the quote by Dr. Squat?
It's always good, better, best.
Yes.
Training method is good if it doesn't hurt you. It's better if you get gains, and obviously best is what's most optimal.
Yeah, and that's going to be individual again. So it's my opinion, and I think of yours, that if you do want to be the best, you need not only to have your subjective, personal, what you think you should be doing, but you need to have someone either online through forums or coaches directly looking at you from an objective measure so that you have an understanding. So what is your thoughts on that specifically for these kind of principles, because they're so different even within one principle?
Right. Well, just to go back to 5-3-1 for a second, Jim Wendler has said repeatedly his entire goal behind that methodology was to come up with something that would allow him to stop thinking and start training more. And a lot of coaches have said similar things when they create their methodologies. But it's a strong feature of 5-3-1 that it's simple, that it's not very complex, and that it's so easy to apply and so easy to program and so easy to modify that just about anybody can do it and be okay. And there's a lot of modifications that he spells out in his work. So he gives people a lot of options. And like you said, it really takes a lot of that effort out because they don't have to program. I would point out, though, that the higher frequency stuff can be just as simple. For instance, on the type of training that I do, which is daily training, if you're going to squat, bench, and deadlift every day, and that's all you're going to do, more or less, then that makes it pretty simple, too. And the athlete can come in and just do their training and hit their daily maxes and then leave. But what makes it a little more complicated when we get into the frequency is that if it's auto-regulated or something like that, that's where that objective input comes in, and where you maybe need somebody looking at you while you're moving and helping you decide how hard you need to push that day, or when you need to back off, or when you need to take a day just to do light work. So that's really where the coaching comes in, but it can still be incredibly simple. So I think, again, it just comes down to what's practical for the athlete at that moment. How much access to coaching do they have? How much work capacity do they have? How much variety do they need to stay interested in the program? Is another consideration. Lyle McDonald has talked about that a lot, where if you give somebody a program that they're not going to do, and then they don't do it, they're not going to make any gains. Yeah. So you clearly have to examine that. And you've got to look at the athlete that you've got and kind of just make a judgment call there as the coach. So it really is case by case. It's very, very contextual.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were to recommend basically a novice athlete who hasn't necessarily started training yet, and they don't know what you would want to do, it seems like you would kind of recommend them start off with some sort of American philosophy-based training, just so that they can get an idea of what maybe they would like. Because it's so general, you're going to find the things that you like and you dislike,
Well, there is something to be said for that, where just, trying the different programs until you find the one that clicks with you. It takes some trial and error for everybody before they really find out how their body works and what's going on. And since it is easy for novices to make gains on just about anything, that does help them too. So they have some room to wiggle around there that the advanced athletes don't necessarily have. But I don't know that I would say that I can make any generalizations about what would be better for them to start on. Because I've got guys that have never lifted before, and they come in the gym, and it's right away right into a Shiko type program or right into a Daily Max type program, and it's just dependent on on the situation in every way. But another thing to note too is generally by the time an athlete gets to me, they're not a novice anymore. So by the time they've reached a level where they're reaching out to me, they've already more or less decided what types of training appeals to them, what types of goals appeal to them, what styles they're going to be using in their lifts. Yeah. So that's not something that I necessarily take a strong stance on, just because novices isn't really something that I do on a daily basis. But more or less, I treat them like I treat everybody else. And first thing they get with me is a needs analysis, and we figure out what they can do and how good they are at it, and then everything else follows from there. And that's really going to kind of paint the picture of what our training templates are going to look like, dependent on those first couple of movement tests.
Awesome. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to talk about for this episode. I was thinking we can move on from here, and you guys can check that out in a minute. Okay, I'm pausing.